The day I walked away from $4 billion was the day I finally learned what wealth meant. The reporters called me reckless. My shareholders called me insane. One financial network spent an entire week trying to explain why a man who had spent 15 years building an empire would destroy his biggest deal with the stroke of a pen. They analyzed market trends. They interviewed economists. They speculated about hidden scandals and secret investigations. None of them got it right. Because the truth had nothing to do with business. It had everything to do with a woman named Sophie Bennett. I still remember the silence inside that boardroom. 43 floors above Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that had made me rich beyond anything I imagined when I was a kid sleeping on a worn-out mattress in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. 12 executives sat around a polished conference table. 3 attorneys waited near the wall. My chief financial officer looked ready to have a heart attack. The acquisition documents sat in front of me. $4 billion in projected profit. The largest deal in Caldwell Capital history. A transaction so massive that financial magazines had already prepared cover stories celebrating it. All I had to do was sign. That was it. One signature. One simple movement of a pen. Instead, I closed the folder. The room went completely still. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The faint vibration of traffic 40 stories below. The nervous breath of a junior analyst sitting near the end of the table. "Ethan," my CFO finally said, his voice tight, "Are we ready to proceed?" I looked down at the documents one last time. Numbers, charts, projections, everything that had defined my life for nearly 2 decades. I used to love this part. The negotiation, the victory, the rush of winning. But that morning, all I felt was empty. The kind of empty that settles deep inside your chest and stays there no matter how much money you make. I thought about my penthouse overlooking Central Park, the private jet waiting at Teterboro Airport, the vacation homes I barely visited, the watch on my wrist worth more than my first car. I had spent years collecting achievements the way some people collected souvenirs. Yet somehow, none of it felt valuable anymore. My fingers tightened around the pen. Then I set it down. "No," I said quietly. The room stared at me. "I'm not signing it." A few people laughed nervously, assuming I was joking. I wasn't. "Ethan," one attorney said carefully, "this acquisition has been in development for 18 months. I know. $4 billion. I know. Investors are expecting. I know exactly what they're expecting." My voice sounded calm. Too calm. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about investors. I wasn't thinking about profit. I wasn't thinking about market share. I was thinking about a small neighborhood library. About children sitting cross-legged on a carpet listening to stories. About a woman with coffee stains on her sleeves and kindness in her eyes. A woman who had changed everything without ever trying to. The boardroom erupted into questions, but their voices faded into background noise. Because as I stared out across the Manhattan skyline, I realized something that terrified me. $4 billion had once felt priceless. Now it felt small. And that was the moment I knew there was no going back. The first headline appeared 23 minutes after I left the boardroom. By lunchtime, every major financial website in America had picked up the story. By dinner, analysts were debating my sanity on national television. I sat alone in my office and watched none of it. Instead, I stood in front of the glass wall overlooking Manhattan and listened to the rain tapping softly against the windows. It was strange. I had spent years chasing the attention of people who suddenly could not stop talking about me. Yet all I wanted was silence. My phone buzzed again. Another call from a board member. The 8th one in less than an hour. I sent it to voicemail. Then another message appeared. This one from my chief operating officer. Emergency meeting. Investors demanding answers. Call immediately. I ignored that too. Outside, thousands of lights stretched across the city like stars trapped on Earth. Somewhere below, millions of people were finishing work, heading home, meeting friends, living lives that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings reports. For years, I had convinced myself that success meant staying above all of it, looking down instead of looking around, winning instead of connecting. The realization felt uncomfortable, like discovering a crack in the foundation of a building you thought was indestructible. My assistant knocked gently before stepping inside. Emily had worked for me for 7 years. Smart, efficient, loyal. She carried a tablet against her chest and looked more nervous than I had ever seen her. "The investors are threatening legal action," she said quietly. Some of them are demanding your resignation. I nodded. Anything else? Emily blinked. Anything else? Ethan, you just walked away from billions of dollars. People are panicking. Aren't you worried? I thought about the question. Then I surprised both of us with my answer. No. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she lowered her voice. Was it really because of that neighborhood project? The question landed harder than she realized. I looked away from the skyline, toward the framed awards lining the shelves. Entrepreneur of the Year, Top CEO, 40 under 40, recognition from people who admired what I had built. Yet none of those plaques had ever made me feel proud for longer than a few minutes. Not the way one memory did. A memory involving a woman standing in front of an aging brick building, refusing a check large enough to change her life. Yes, I finally said. It was because of that project. Emily studied me carefully. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. A small smile. The kind people wear when they finally understand something they have been wondering about for a long time. You know, she said, ever since you met her, you've been different. Different how? Human. The word hit me harder than any criticism on television ever could. Human. Not brilliant. Not powerful. Not successful. Human. After she left, I sat alone behind my desk and stared at a photograph on my phone. A candid picture taken months earlier. Sophie Bennett standing outside a small community library, holding a stack of books against her chest while laughing at something one of the children had said. She did not know the photo existed. I had never intended to keep it. Yet there it was. The most valuable thing in a phone filled with assets worth billions. And as thunder rolled softly beyond the city skyline, I found myself thinking about the first time I saw her and how impossible it seemed that one ordinary afternoon had changed everything. 3 months earlier, my life ran with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every morning started at 5:30. Every meeting was scheduled weeks in advance. Every decision was measured against profit, risk, and long-term growth. I liked it that way. Predictable, controlled, efficient. At 38 years old, I had built Caldwell Capital into one of the most successful investment firms in the country, and I believed discipline was the reason. Feelings were distractions. Sentiment was expensive. Attachment created weakness. At least that was what I told myself. The morning everything began felt completely ordinary. The sky over Manhattan was clear. Sunlight reflected off the glass towers surrounding our headquarters. My driver navigated through traffic while I reviewed acquisition reports on a tablet balanced against my knee. Numbers filled the screen. Revenue projections, property valuations, development plans. The language I understood better than anything else. By 8:15, I was seated in a conference room with 12 executives discussing a redevelopment project on the east side of the city. Entire blocks would be transformed. New retail space, luxury apartments, office buildings. Investors loved it. The projected returns were extraordinary. As the presentation continued, one slide appeared on the screen showing a map of the neighborhood. Several structures were highlighted in red. Properties still resisting acquisition. Most were expected. A laundromat, a small diner, a repair shop. Then my attention settled on one address. Bennett Community Library. The photograph looked almost out of place among the surrounding buildings. A modest brick structure with flower boxes beneath the windows and a hand-painted sign above the entrance. It seemed insignificant compared to the scale of the project. Yet for some reason, I kept looking at it. Our acquisition manager noticed. "That one has been difficult," he said. "The owner refuses every offer." I glanced up. Owner? Not exactly. Director. Her name is Sophie Bennett. We increased the offer 3 times. She keeps saying no. A few people around the table chuckled. One executive shook his head. Everybody has a number. Eventually she will take it. Normally, I would have agreed. In business, everything had a value. Every asset, every contract, every piece of land. That belief had served me well for years. So I simply nodded and moved on. By noon, I had forgotten about the library entirely. Or at least I thought I had. Later that afternoon, my helicopter landed on the rooftop of a hotel where I was scheduled to meet potential investors. The event was elegant, expensive, perfectly organized. Men in tailored suits discussed markets over sparkling water and carefully prepared lunches. Conversations revolved around opportunities, expansion, and growth. The topics were familiar, comfortable. Yet somewhere between presentations, my thoughts drifted unexpectedly back to that small building. Back to the woman who kept rejecting offers most people would consider life-changing. I did not know what she looked like. I did not know her story. All I knew was that she had said no. And for reasons I could not explain, I found myself wondering why. That evening, as Manhattan lights flickered to life outside my office window, I instructed my team to schedule a personal visit to the neighborhood. At the time, I told myself it was about the project, about efficiency, about removing obstacles. Looking back now, I know that was the first lie I told myself. The neighborhood looked nothing like the world I normally occupied. There were no glass towers scraping the clouds, no luxury cars lined along spotless curbs, no executives rushing between meetings while staring at their phones. Instead, I found tree-lined sidewalks, family-owned businesses, and people who actually seemed to know their neighbors. My driver slowed as we turned onto Maple Street. I looked out the window and immediately recognized the building from the presentation slide. Bennett Community Library sat on the corner beneath a canopy of old oak trees. The brick exterior showed its age. The sign above the entrance had clearly been repainted more than once. Flower boxes overflowed with bright colors beneath the windows. It should have looked insignificant. Instead, it looked alive. Children were gathered near the entrance. Some sat on the steps reading books. Others laughed while chasing each other across the small lawn. The scene felt strangely foreign. Not because it was unusual, but because I could not remember the last time I had stopped long enough to notice something so simple. I stepped out of the car and crossed the sidewalk. The afternoon sun warmed the pavement beneath my shoes. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes swayed gently. A dog barked in the distance. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind of details I usually ignored. The bell above the library door chimed as I entered. The scent hit me immediately. Books. Coffee. Old wood. The interior was modest, but welcoming. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Comfortable chairs occupied reading corners. Handwritten recommendations were attached to several displays. Nothing about the space was impressive by corporate standards. Yet people smiled here. That alone made it different from most boardrooms I had visited. I walked farther inside. Then I saw her. Sophie Bennett stood near a table stacked with children's books. Sunlight streamed through a nearby window and illuminated strands of light brown hair that had slipped loose from a practical ponytail. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a blue cardigan with rolled sleeves. No designer labels. No expensive jewelry. Just a woman helping a young boy find a book about dinosaurs. She crouched beside him and listened as though his question was the most important thing in the world. The boy grinned. Sophie grinned back. Something tightened unexpectedly in my chest. She looked happy. Not performatively happy. Not networking event happy. Genuinely happy. The kind of happiness money could never manufacture. I stood there longer than I should have. Watching. Trying to understand why a woman who had turned down a life-changing amount of money seemed so completely at peace with her decision. Eventually she noticed me. Her eyes lifted. Green. Clear. Curious. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Then she offered a polite smile. Can I help you find something? I had negotiated billion-dollar transactions without hesitation. I had spoken before thousands of investors. Yet standing inside that small library, facing a woman who had no reason to be impressed by me, I found myself searching for the right words. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized I did not have them. I finally cleared my throat and offered the first explanation that came to mind. I am looking into the neighborhood redevelopment project. Sophie nodded slowly, as if that answer explained nothing and everything at the same time. Then you are probably here about the building. Her voice was calm, not defensive, not impressed, just honest. I glanced around the library. Children sat reading in colorful corners. A retired man flipped through a newspaper near the front window. A young mother helped her daughter sound out difficult words. It felt less like a building and more like a living room for an entire community. You have received several offers, I said. We have. And you declined all of them. We did. Her answers were short, but never rude. I found that strangely disarming. Most people became nervous around wealth. Others became eager. Sophie seemed completely unaffected. Why? I asked. She tilted her head slightly. Why did we decline? Yes. Sophie looked around the room before answering. Because not everything valuable fits on a spreadsheet. The response should have annoyed me. Instead, it made me curious. She walked toward a nearby bookshelf and motioned for me to follow. I did. This shelf was donated by a teacher who spent 30 years working in the neighborhood, she said. That reading corner was built by volunteers after a storm damaged part of the building. The computers in the back came from local fundraising drives. Every section of this place has a story. She ran her fingers lightly along the spine of an old hardcover novel. People do not come here because the furniture is expensive. They come because they belong here. Belong. The word lingered in my thoughts. I could not remember the last time I had felt that way anywhere. My penthouse was beautiful. My office was impressive. My vacation homes were luxurious. But none of them felt like they belonged to me. They felt like assets. Sophie was speaking to a teenager near the circulation desk when an elderly woman approached carrying a stack of books. Sophie immediately smiled and greeted her by name. Then another person stopped to ask about an upcoming event. Then a child tugged on her sleeve with a question about a reading challenge. Sophie somehow gave every person her full attention. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. Watching her felt like observing a skill I had never learned. An hour passed without me noticing. Eventually, Sophie returned and folded her arms. So, Mr. Caldwell, are you here as an investor or as a visitor? The question caught me off guard. I had spent years being exactly one thing. An investor. Someone who evaluated opportunities and calculated outcomes. Yet standing there, I found myself answering differently. I am not sure. A small smile appeared on her face. Good. Most important things start with that answer. Then she glanced toward the clock on the wall. We are hosting Story Hour in 10 minutes. You are welcome to stay if you would like. I should have left. I had meetings waiting downtown. Calls to return. Decisions worth millions sitting on my desk. Instead, I heard myself say something unexpected. I would like that. And as Sophie smiled again and walked away to prepare for the event, I realized I had just postponed an entire afternoon of business for a reason I could not explain. Story Hour began with 12 children gathering on a brightly colored rug near the center of the library. Some carried stuffed animals. Others clutched books almost as large as their arms. Sophie sat in a wooden chair at the front of the group, a hardcover storybook resting in her lap. I took a seat in the back, intending to stay for a few minutes before returning to my office. That was the plan. Then Sophie started reading. Her voice filled the room with a warmth that felt impossible to quantify. The children leaned forward, completely absorbed. They laughed at funny parts, gasped at surprises, asked questions whenever curiosity got the better of them. Sophie answered everyone with patience. Not the forced patience people use when they are trying to appear kind. Real patience, genuine attention. As the story continued, I found myself watching the children instead of the book. Their faces were bright with excitement. Their focus was absolute. In my world, attention was bought with advertising budgets and marketing campaigns. Here, one woman with a book held an entire room captive without spending a single dollar. When the story ended, applause erupted from the children. One little girl immediately raised her hand. Can we read another one? Sophie laughed softly. Tomorrow. Groans filled the room. The little girl crossed her arms dramatically. That is not fair. Sophie smiled. The best stories are worth waiting for. The answer somehow satisfied everyone. As parents began gathering their children, I noticed something unusual. Nearly every family stopped to thank Sophie before leaving. Some offered homemade cookies. Others handed her handwritten notes. One elderly man dropped off a small donation envelope and quietly wished her luck with an upcoming fundraiser. Nobody seemed obligated to help. They simply wanted to. Why? Because they cared. The realization lingered with me long after the room emptied. Sophie approached carrying a stack of books. So, Mr. Caldwell, what did you think? I searched for the correct response. Honestly, I expected a library. This feels more like a community center. Her smile widened. That is probably the nicest compliment anyone has ever given us. She placed the books onto a nearby cart. Then she gestured toward a bulletin board covered with photographs. Summer reading programs, scholarship celebrations, community dinners, volunteer projects. Every image showed smiling faces. Every image showed people together. We help however we can, Sophie said. Sometimes people need books. Sometimes they need support. Sometimes they just need somewhere to feel welcome. I studied the photographs. How long have you been doing this? Almost 10 years. You could have earned more somewhere else. Sophie laughed. Considerably more. Then why stay? She looked around the library before answering. Because every day I get to see proof that small things matter. A child finishes their first chapter book. A teenager earns a scholarship. A lonely person makes a friend. Most people overlook moments like that. I do not. Her words settled into the silence between us. Small things matter. It sounded simple. Yet standing there, I realized my entire career had been built around chasing bigger things. Bigger profits. Bigger projects. Bigger victories. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped noticing everything else. And as late afternoon sunlight painted the library windows gold, I found myself wondering whether Sophie Bennett had just taught me something worth more than any investment lesson I had ever learned. Over the next few weeks, I kept finding reasons to return. At least that was what I told myself. Sometimes I arrived with questions about the redevelopment project. Sometimes I claimed I needed clarification about neighborhood programs. Once, I stopped by under the excuse of delivering information my team could have emailed in less than 30 seconds. Sophie never called me out on it. If she noticed the pattern, she kept it to herself. One Thursday afternoon, I arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee from a small shop down the street. The moment I walked through the door, I realized how ridiculous the gesture felt. I had negotiated mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars without feeling nervous. Yet offering coffee to a librarian somehow made me question every decision I had made that morning. Sophie looked up from her desk and smiled. "Is one of those for me?" Her question caught me off guard. I laughed. The sound surprised both of us. It had been a long time since laughter came naturally. "Yes," I said. "It is." She accepted the cup and took a sip. Then her eyes widened slightly. "You remembered my order." I shrugged. It did not seem important enough to mention that I remembered almost everything she told me. The books she recommended. The community events she organized. The names of children who visited every week. Details that should have slipped from memory somehow stayed. We spent the afternoon preparing for a weekend fundraiser. Mostly, I carried boxes while Sophie organized supplies. The work itself was simple. The conversations were not. At one point, she asked about my childhood. The question arrived so unexpectedly that I nearly dropped a stack of flyers. Most people never asked. They assumed success meant a perfect beginning. It did not. "I grew up in Queens," I said. "Small apartment. My mother worked 2 jobs. My father worked all the time." Sophie nodded quietly. "Were you close with him?" I stared at a cardboard box for a few seconds before answering. "Not really. He believed achievement solved everything. If I got good grades, he wanted better grades. If I succeeded, he wanted more success. Nothing ever felt finished." The words came easier than I expected. Sophie listened without interrupting. No advice. No judgment. Just attention. That somehow made it harder to hide the truth. I spent most of my life trying to earn approval that never came, I admitted. Even after he passed away, I kept chasing it. Bigger deals. Bigger accomplishments. Bigger numbers. Sophie looked at me for a long moment. And did it work? The question settled heavily between us. Outside, sunlight filtered through the library windows. Somewhere in the building, a child laughed. I slowly shook my head. "No." Sophie smiled sadly. "Sometimes people spend so much time climbing a ladder that they forget to ask whether it is leaning against the right wall." I should have argued. I should have defended the life I built. Instead, I stood there in silence because deep down I knew she was right. And for the first time in years, the possibility frightened me more than any business risk ever had. The fundraiser took place on a Saturday morning beneath a sky so clear it looked painted. Folding tables lined the sidewalk outside the library. Volunteers arranged donated books into neat rows. Children ran between booths carrying balloons while local musicians played soft acoustic songs near the entrance. By every financial measure I understood, the event was small. Yet by noon, more people had gathered than I had expected. Families, teachers, retirees, college students. Entire groups of neighbors who seemed genuinely excited to support a place that earned no profit at all. I arrived early, intending to stay for an hour. Instead, I spent the entire day there. Sophie immediately put me to work carrying supplies and helping set up displays. She never treated me like a billionaire. Never treated me like someone important. To her, I was simply another volunteer. Strangely, I preferred it that way. Around lunchtime, a boy named Tyler challenged me to a game involving bean bags and plastic buckets. I accepted without thinking. 5 minutes later, I lost badly in front of half the neighborhood. The crowd erupted with laughter. Tyler celebrated as though he had won a championship. Sophie nearly spilled her lemonade trying not to laugh. I should have been embarrassed. Instead, I found myself laughing too. Real laughter. The kind that left your stomach sore afterward. At one point, Sophie handed me a paper plate holding a slice of homemade apple pie. One of our volunteers baked it, she said. I took a bite. It was probably the best pie I had eaten in years. Not because it was perfect, because someone had made it for people they cared about. The thought lingered unexpectedly. Later that afternoon, an elderly man approached our table. His back was slightly bent with age, and his hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket. He carefully placed $20 into the donation jar. Sophie thanked him warmly. The man smiled. This place helped me after my wife passed away, he said softly. I just wanted to give something back. Then he walked away. $20. In my world, $20 was meaningless. Less than the cost of parking in parts of Manhattan. Yet somehow that donation felt larger than transactions involving millions. Because it represented gratitude, connection, meaning, things no balance sheet could accurately measure. As the event continued, I caught myself studying Sophie whenever she was not looking. She moved through the crowd greeting everyone by name, remembering birthdays, asking about families, listening to stories, making people feel seen. It was a skill more powerful than influence and far rarer than intelligence. The sun had started sinking toward the horizon when Sophie sat beside me on the library steps. The fundraiser had exceeded every goal. Volunteers were celebrating nearby. Children chased each other across the grass. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and lemonade. Sophie leaned back and smiled. Today was a good day. I looked around at the crowd, at the laughter, at the simple joy surrounding us. Then I realized something that stopped me cold. For the first time in years, I had gone an entire day without thinking about money. And somehow, it had been one of the best days of my life. After the fundraiser, something shifted inside me. At first, the change was small enough to ignore. I started leaving the office earlier. I canceled meetings that no longer seemed important. I spent less time staring at market reports and more time finding excuses to visit the library. My executives noticed immediately. One afternoon, Emily stepped into my office holding a folder and narrowed her eyes. You are smiling more. I looked up from my desk. Am I? Yes. It is unsettling. I laughed. Another reaction that had become increasingly common around Sophie. The truth was simple. Somewhere between story hours and fundraiser tables, I had started looking forward to things again. Not transactions. Not acquisitions. Moments. A conversation over coffee. A joke from one of the neighborhood kids. The sound of Sophie laughing when something genuinely amused her. The realization arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting alone in my penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city lights shimmered through the rain-covered windows. A perfectly prepared dinner sat untouched on the kitchen counter. My phone buzzed with updates from overseas markets. Another investment opportunity. Another potential victory. Normally, I would have been interested. Instead, I found myself scrolling through photos from the fundraiser. There was Sophie standing beside a donation table. Sophie helping a child choose a book. Sophie laughing at something outside the frame. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Then a thought entered my mind, so suddenly it stole my breath. I was in love with her. The words felt impossible. Ridiculous. I was 38 years old. I had spent my entire adult life treating emotions like obstacles to overcome. Yet there it was. Clear and undeniable. I set the phone down and walked to the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere below, thousands of people were rushing home through the storm. For years, I had believed love belonged in other people's stories. Not mine. My life had been built around goals and outcomes. Love offered neither. It could not be measured. It could not be controlled. It came with no guarantees. That realization should have frightened me. Instead, it made me feel alive. The next afternoon, I stopped by the library. Sophie was arranging new arrivals near the front desk. She looked up and smiled the moment she saw me. That simple smile somehow brightened the entire room. Tough day? She asked. I leaned against a bookshelf. How can you tell? You have your thinking face. My thinking face? She nodded. The one where you look like you are trying to solve a puzzle nobody else can see. I laughed softly. Maybe I am. Sophie studied me for a second. Then her expression softened. Whatever it is, you will figure it out. Her confidence in me felt strangely personal. More meaningful than praise from investors or business magazines. Because Sophie believed in people. Not achievements. Not resumes. People. As she returned to organizing books, I watched her for a moment longer than I should have. And standing there among shelves filled with stories, I realized the biggest risk of my life was no longer losing money. It was finding the courage to tell Sophie Bennett how much she had come to mean to me. 2 days later, everything fell apart. Looking back, the signs had been there. The unanswered calls from my acquisition team. The increasingly urgent emails from investors. The documents piling up on my desk demanding final approval. For weeks, I had been avoiding a decision I knew could not be postponed forever. The redevelopment project was approaching its final stage. Contracts were being prepared. Timelines were being finalized. Everyone expected me to move forward. Everyone except me. That Thursday afternoon, I left a meeting early and headed toward the library carrying something I had spent far too much time choosing. A first edition of one of Sophie's favorite novels. Nothing extravagant, just thoughtful, or at least I hoped so. The sky was overcast when I arrived. The bell above the library door chimed softly as I stepped inside. Something felt different immediately. The usual warmth was gone. The familiar sounds of conversation seemed distant. Even the air felt heavier. Then I saw Sophie. She stood behind the front desk, holding several sheets of paper in her hands. Her face was pale. Her green eyes were fixed on me with an expression I had never seen before. Disappointment. My stomach dropped. "Sophie," I began. She held up the papers. "Is this true?" I recognized the documents instantly. Acquisition reports. Property maps. Internal projections. Somehow she had gotten access to information she was never supposed to see. My heart sank. Sophie looked down at the pages before meeting my eyes again. "The library is part of the redevelopment plan. You knew that from the beginning." The words landed like stones. I opened my mouth to explain. Nothing came out. Because she was right. I had known from the very first day. "You came here because of the project," she continued quietly. "Not because of me." "That is not true." Her expression tightened. "Then what is true, Ethan? Tell me." The library fell silent. Even the few visitors nearby seemed to sense something important was happening. I took a step forward. "Sophie, please let me explain. I was going to tell you." Her laugh was small and painful. "When? After the contracts were signed? After this place was gone?" "No, never that." But even as I said the words, I knew how weak they sounded. Because I had waited. I had convinced myself there would be a better moment. A safer moment. A moment when the truth would hurt less. Instead, my silence had become its own betrayal. Sophie looked at me for a long time. The kind of look that strips away every excuse. Every defense. "I trusted you," she said softly. Those 4 words hurt more than any accusation could have. Around us, the library remained quiet. The shelves. The books. The reading corner where children gathered every week. Everything suddenly felt fragile. Sophie carefully set the papers on the desk. "I think you should leave, Ethan." The words were polite. Calm. Final. For a moment, I stood frozen. Then I nodded once. Because there was nothing else I could do. As I turned toward the door, the bell chimed again overhead. And for the first time since meeting Sophie Bennett, I walked out of the library knowing I might have lost the one thing in my life that truly mattered. The following week should have been the greatest professional victory of my career. Every major obstacle had disappeared. Investors were satisfied. Attorneys finalized documents. Financial analysts praised the project as a transformative success. By every traditional measure, I had won. Yet every morning felt heavier than the one before. The first few days after leaving the library, I told myself Sophie simply needed time. Time to cool down. Time to understand. Time for me to explain everything properly. Then I stopped by one afternoon and found the front door locked. A handwritten sign announced the library was closed for a community outreach event. The next day, I returned again. Sophie was there, but she never looked up when I entered. Another volunteer helped visitors. Another volunteer answered questions. Sophie stayed busy organizing shelves on the far side of the building. The message was clear. She did not want to talk to me. I left without saying a word. Back in Manhattan, life continued moving at full speed. Meetings filled my calendar. Reporters requested interviews. Investors celebrated projected returns. I sat through all of it feeling strangely detached. One Friday morning, I stood before a room filled with executives presenting the final redevelopment timeline. The presentation lasted nearly an hour. Charts appeared on giant screens. Forecasts promised extraordinary growth. Applause followed the conclusion. Everyone looked pleased except me. "Ethan," one board member said afterward, "this project will define your legacy." Legacy. The word echoed in my mind long after the meeting ended. That evening, I found myself standing alone in my penthouse staring out at the city. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness. Somewhere among them was the library. Somewhere among them was Sophie. I thought about all the things I had achieved. The companies acquired. The deals completed. The wealth accumulated. For years, I believed those accomplishments would eventually create fulfillment. Instead, the higher I climbed, the lonelier everything became. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Emily. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. You should not be alone tonight, she said immediately. That sounds ominous. It is concern. There is a difference. I smiled faintly. Emily hesitated before continuing. You miss her. The directness caught me off guard. More than I expected. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then Emily sighed. Ethan, I have worked for you for 7 years. I have seen you negotiate impossible deals without blinking. I have seen you remain calm during crises that would terrify most people. I have never seen you look the way you have looked this week. And how is that? Lost. After we hung up, I sat alone in the dark for a long time. No television. No music. Just silence. The kind of silence that forces honesty. Eventually, I opened my laptop and reviewed the redevelopment plans one more time. Building by building. Street by street. Then I reached the page showing Bennett Community Library. I stared at the image until it blurred. For months, I had been trying to convince myself there was a way to keep everything. The project, the profits, the investors, Sophie. But deep down, I finally understood the truth. Some choices demanded a sacrifice. And as I sat there looking at the library that had changed my life, I realized I already knew exactly what I needed to do. The next morning, I arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The city outside was still wrapped in shades of gray when I stepped into the boardroom. One by one, executives filtered through the doors carrying laptops, reports, and expectations. They believed they were attending the final approval meeting. In a way, they were. By 8 o'clock, every seat was occupied. Attorneys sat along one wall. Investors joined through video screens. My chief financial officer looked exhausted. Nobody smiled. The atmosphere carried the tension of a moment years in the making. I looked around the room and realized something strange. Just a few months earlier, this would have been the most important day of my life. Now it felt like a test of something entirely different. The presentation began. Revenue projections filled giant screens. Charts displayed extraordinary growth. Market analysts predicted record returns. Every slide reinforced the same conclusion. The project was a financial masterpiece. When the final chart disappeared, the room grew quiet. My chief financial officer nodded toward the documents in front of me. We are ready for your approval, Ethan. Every eye turned in my direction. The moment had arrived. I thought about the library. I thought about the reading corner filled with children. I thought about the volunteers who donated their time without expecting anything in return. I thought about the elderly man who gave $20 because the place had helped him through grief. Most of all, I thought about Sophie. Her smile, her kindness, her belief that small things mattered. For years, I had measured value by numbers. Sophie had taught me there were other ways to measure it. I slowly closed the folder in front of me. Confusion spread across the room immediately. Then concern. Then disbelief. I am not approving the project, I said. Silence followed. Complete silence. Someone laughed nervously. Another executive assumed I was joking. I was not. Ethan, one investor finally said, this project represents billions in future revenue. I know. The board approved it months ago. I know. Then why are you doing this? I looked around the room. Because I finally understand what we are actually destroying. The response was met with stunned expressions. Arguments followed. Questions followed. Warnings followed. People spoke about shareholder responsibility, market confidence, and long-term consequences. I listened to every concern. Then I repeated the same answer. No. For the first time in my professional life, profit was not enough. Hours later, news of the decision spread across financial markets. Analysts called it irrational. Investors called it reckless. Headlines appeared within minutes. Yet as I left the building and stepped into the afternoon sunlight, I felt lighter than I had in years. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages demanding explanations. I ignored all of them. Instead, I climbed into my car and gave the driver a familiar address. 40 minutes later, I stood across the street from Bennett Community Library. Children were gathered near the entrance. Volunteers moved supplies inside. Life continued exactly as it had before. The building was still standing. The neighborhood was still breathing. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I allowed myself to hope. Because I had finally made a choice. Not the profitable choice. Not the safe choice. The right one. The only question remaining was whether Sophie Bennett would ever be willing to forgive me for waiting so long to make it. 1 year later, the library looked different. Not larger. Not grander. Just stronger. Fresh paint covered the exterior brick. New reading spaces filled corners that once sat empty. Additional programs served hundreds of families throughout the neighborhood. The building still stood exactly where it always had, but now it carried the quiet confidence of something that had survived a storm and emerged better for it. I stood across the street on a bright spring morning and watched children race toward the entrance carrying backpacks and books. Their laughter drifted through the air along with the scent of fresh flowers blooming in nearby planters. Some things had changed over the past year. Others had remained exactly the same. I crossed the street and pushed open the familiar door. The bell chimed overhead, a sound I would recognize anywhere. Inside, sunlight poured through the windows. Volunteers moved between shelves. Readers sat comfortably in corners. The atmosphere felt warm, alive, home. Sophie stood near the front desk, helping a young girl choose a book. Her hair was a little longer now. Her smile was exactly the same. The moment she looked up and saw me, something inside my chest settled into place. A year earlier, I had spent my life chasing larger numbers. Bigger returns. Bigger opportunities. Bigger victories. Now I understood that the most meaningful things rarely appeared on financial statements. Sophie thanked the young girl and watched her hurry away. Then she walked toward me. Neither of us spoke immediately. We simply stood there smiling like two people remembering a long journey. "The new scholarship program is doing well," she said. "Better than expected." That was another thing that had changed. After canceling the redevelopment project, I had redirected resources toward community programs across the city. Libraries, education initiatives, local partnerships. Not because it improved public relations. Not because it created profit. Because it mattered. Sophie had taught me that. She glanced around the room. "You know, people still talk about your decision." I laughed softly. "I know. Some still think I lost my mind." Sophie smiled. "Maybe. But a lot of people think you found your heart." Her words warmed me more than any professional award ever had. We walked together through the library, passing shelves filled with stories and memories. The reading corner was occupied by children listening to a volunteer read aloud. Parents chatted nearby. Neighbors greeted one another by name. Life moved gently around us. At one point, Sophie reached for my hand. A simple gesture. Quiet. Natural. Yet it meant more than every contract I had signed throughout my career. I looked around the room one last time and realized something extraordinary. The project I had abandoned would have made me richer. There was no denying that. But wealth and worth were not the same thing. I understood that now. Success had given me comfort. Achievement had given me recognition. But love had given me purpose. As sunlight filled the library and laughter echoed softly through the shelves, I thought about the man I used to be. Then I thought about the life standing beside me. And for the first time, I knew with complete certainty that the greatest return I would ever receive had never been measured in dollars. It had been measured in second chances, shared moments, and the courage to choose people over profit. Everything else was just math,